Even though Union troops controlled the mouth of the Chpt River, Wilmington had not yet fallen. General Bragg had 7,600 men left, and the Confederates were dug in at Fort Anderson. Robert Oak had 4,400 men entrenched at Sugarloaf. General Terry decided to repair Fort Fisher and wait for reinforcements before launching an attack towards Wilmington. By February, Union General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant was determined to capture Wilmington. He sent Major General John Schofield to take command of the Union forces, along with 21,000 troops. Schofield did not want to wait for these extra men to arrive, and decided to attack Sugarloaf with the 13,000 men he had available. On February 11th, the Union Army advanced northwards. Admiral Porter's fleet began bombarding Sugarloaf and Fort Anderson from both the ocean and the Chpt River, but the shelling did little damage. Meanwhile, Union forces were driving General Oak's pickets back to Sugarloaf. A brigade of black soldiers, the 6th United States Colored Troops, led the way. Amazingly, one Confederate soldier was taken prisoner by his former slave. Other skirmishers managed to capture rebel positions on Myrtle Sound. Late in the morning, the main Union force attacked. After 5 hours of fighting, it was apparent that they would not break the rebel lines, and they halted and dug trenches. Unable to penetrate the line, Union forces then tried to advance up Myrtle Sound, cross the sound with pontoon bridges and catch the Confederates from the rear. The first time the move was attempted, bad weather halted the advance. The next time, the advance fell apart when wagons carrying the pontoons broke down. General Schofield gave up and decided to try and capture Fort Anderson instead. Fort Anderson's earthworks were a mile long and mounted 10 large cannon. The area around the fort was filled with ponds and swamps. Assaulting the fort would prove difficult, and it was defended by almost 2,300 men under Brigadier General Johnson Agud. By February 16th, Schofield had moved 6,000 men to the opposite side of the river to prepare to attack Fort Anderson. The next day, they advanced northwards, skirmishing with Confederate cavalry. At the same time, Porter's ironclads and gunboats were fighting another artillery duel with the fort, doing little damage. On February 18th, Union infantry attacked the fort, charging right into volleys of rifle and cannon fire. The Federals halted and dug in, awaiting naval gunfire support. Porter's fleet shelled the fort, firing 2,700 shells and damaging the structure, but they failed to dislodge the defenders. The Union Army tried to outflank the fort that day, sending 3,000 men around Orton Pond to take the fort from the rear. They brushed aside a small force of Confederate cavalry, advanced along the edge of the pond and set up camp for the night. Admiral Porter badly wanted to get his fleet closer to the fort, but could not because the Confederates had filled the river with mines. Lieutenant William Cushing, famous for sinking the CSS Albemarle the previous October, came up with a plan. He had a fake ironclad, cobbled together from an old boat and some barrels and canvas. The idea was to trick the Confederates into detonating their mines when the unmanned vessel passed over. The plan was put into action on the 18th and caused the rebels to blow up some of their mines, but they suspected a trick and did not expend all of them. Heavily outnumbered and with no way to attack the Union fleet, General Agud realized that his situation was hopeless. After consulting with General Oak throughout the night, he decided to abandon the fort. In the middle of the night, the Confederate garrison retreated towards Wilmington. The next morning, Union troops rounded Orton Pond and stormed the fort, only to find it deserted. In the confusion, they were shelled by the Union fleet, and had to raise a white flag to get them to stop. The abandonment of Fort Anderson forced Robert Oak to abandon Sugarloaf. Both Oak and Agud retreated towards Wilmington to make a last stand. Agud's men halted their retreat at Town Creek, where Bragg had built some small earthworks. Oak stopped on the opposite bank, at Battery Mears, where there were several gun batteries that mounted 16 heavy cannon. After failing to find a shallow spot across Town Creek, some Union troops discovered a flatboat and used that to ferry some of the men across undetected. Fighting ensued in the swamps and marsh grass. Both sides shelled each other from across the stream, and soldiers skirmished across the creek. The next day, the Union troops across the creek advanced, driving back the Confederates through the swamps and moccasins. General Haggard quickly discovered that he was outflanked and decided to retreat. But the Union commanders learned that Haggard was retreating, and they sent troops up the Telegraph Road to cut him off. There they attacked the Confederate force under Colonel Charles Simonton. Simonton's men fought desperately from behind their earthworks, but in the end the outnumbered rebels were forced to surrender. The rest of Haggard's men beat a hasty retreat, burning bridges behind them. On February 20th, on the other side of the river, General Terry's men advanced on General Oak's last line across Federal Point Road. The Union soldiers charged the earthworks, but heavy fire halted their advance. At the same time, Porter's gunboats shelled the rebel batteries along the river, but they did little damage, and the gunboat Sassacus was nearly sunk by the rebel cannon. That evening, the Confederates floated around 100 miles down the Cape Fear, but an escaped slave warned the Federals. The Union sailors set up nets to catch the bombs, but some drifted through and damaged several ships. February 21st saw more fighting along Oak's line at Federal Point Road. General Terry's men attacked all along the line, but most of them were pinned down by fire from the Confederates. The Union commanders were convinced that an all-out assault would be a disaster and pulled back. After their victory at Town Creek, Union forces surged towards Wilmington. When they reached the Brunswick River, they found that the rebels had left several pontoon bridges intact. Crossing the river, advance units arrived on the west bank of the Cape Fear, opposite Wilmington. Without warning, Confederate artillery opened fire from Market Street in downtown Wilmington. The surprised Federals retreated back a short ways and dug trenches. In reply, Union artillery opened fire, damaging several buildings. By this time Braxton Bragg was preparing to evacuate Wilmington. Supplies were burned, ships were scuttled, and other supplies were sent out on trains. Before dawn, on February 22nd, the remaining Confederate troops marched out of the city. Robert Oak abandoned his defenses and retreated. On that morning, Union troops entered Wilmington. Bragg was to retreat towards Goldsboro, where he would unite with General Joseph E. Johnston in an attempt to stop William T. Sherman's march through the Carolinas. Wilmington had been the last open Confederate port. Now that it had fallen, the Confederacy could no longer import war material.